The chandeliers threw a pale, tremulous light across the long table, varnish gleaming like a river of old promises. The scent of roasting pork braided with perfumed hair and tobacco smoke, and somewhere beneath it all, a damp, earthy smell, as if the cellar itself exhaled memories. Laughter glanced off the walls like bright coins. Silverware sang when goblets touched. No one noticed the way Lila stood at the edge of the room, a small figure in the plain linen, hands bruised and clever, holding a tray that shook not with fear, but with a careful, practiced steadiness. A stray candle guttered and flared, casting her shadow to the far end of the hall, where the bride and groom sat high, their smiles polished and unquestioned. It would take only a sliver of time, a tilt of a cup, and the music that night would hide something that would not be easily buried. If you stay with me, you will see how a single act of desperate reckoning could reverberate through a town, through registers, and into the margins of history. If this opening strikes you, subscribe to hear more stories like this one. Coastal Georgia, 1858. In a plantation house that called itself hospitable, the oldest chains were dressed in new linens. Lila had been born by lamplight in the back room of a cabin that knew the names of storms. Her first breath carried the taste of wood smoke and molasses. Her first lullaby was the rumble of wagons at dawn. She learned, early, the geometry of silence. Which voice rose to be answered, and which voice was meant to be ignored. Her mother, Mara, taught her to count threads as if they were hours, to knot and mend, to read the weather in the angle of the smoke. Mara spoke rarely of freedom, but when she did, the word fell soft and heavy, like a coin that did not belong in the hand. They buried Lila's father under a hastily dug plank when a fever took him the winter Lila was 6. Official papers listed him as property removed by theft of health. That loss became a ledger that Lila carried. She kept it under her tongue, in the small calculations of how many days until harvest, how many errands until a neighbor's child would learn to read. As a child, she learned to trace names on the dirt with a stick, and to keep secrets under the hem of her skirt. The plantation had a language of its own, and Lila became fluent. She learned how Master Jonas Whitmore liked his corridors swept at a particular angle, how Lady Eleanor preferred the hydrangeas cut before noon, how the clerk at the registry glanced over his spectacles if a black hand reached for paper. These were skills that kept you alive and small. But she learned other things in corners where the light was dimmer. There was a woman named Miriam, older than the rust on the Adana, whose hands smelled of herbs and ink. Miriam taught Lila to read letters in the margins of ledgers, to find the handwriting that betrayed a man's habit, to understand the geometry of a plan. The instruction came between mending socks and husking corn, folded into the rhythm of labor, and it was forbidden and sacred. Lila learned to parse the world not only by order, but by intention, to see where a servant's glance lingered and where a ledger hid a margin note that could change a life. Those early years were also marked by small cruelties that stacked like winter wood. Deputy Harlan, who wore his authority like a belt, would come through on market days, palms outstretched for favors. Reverend Caldwell spoke of sin with a voice like cracked glass and sat down to hearty meals while the men he preached to cleaned. Thomas the cook, broad-shouldered and soft in ways that made him laugh, would save Lila a crust behind the kitchen stove. Rosa, a girl a year older than Lila, taught her the cadence of a conspirator's whisper. Samuel, who passed as a conductor in underground circles that moved like shadows between county lines, once left a folded scrap with the word "listen" tucked into the top of a flour barrel. It was the beginning of a map. These people were the lattice that held Lila when the storms came. They were named, real, and their acts small in daylight and large in consequence after dusk. Miriam's teaching moved past letters into the ways of medicines and mixtures that passed for remedies. She showed Lila how to steep bitter barks and to draw oil from roots, how to balance a tincture so a fever would break without scalding the throat. She taught an economy of touch, the way a bruised wrist could be concealed with a bandage and a story. There was also a darker scholarly bent to Miriam's lessons. Histories copied in furtive hands, the names of men who had sued for their freedom and lost in courts that recorded arguments like sermons. These lessons became a private curriculum. They were the tools that turned observation into plan. Lila learned the sound of a lie in the cadence of a man's boast, and she learned to move through a room like a shadow with purpose. Education here was not a luxury, but a kind of survival. Not all learning came from one teacher. Thomas taught her the art of reading a room through heat and scent, the way gravy or stew held gossip in its steam. Samuel taught caution, how to plant your feet and wait for the cadence of a patrol to pass before stepping across a yard. Lady Eleanor, in a rare flash of softness, once let Lila straighten the bride's veil and murmured a word that could be read as kindness or as ownership. These small, contradictory gestures taught Lila that the world was a lattice of favors and debts. Alliances and public claims. She collected them like coins, each with a stamped face to be remembered when the time for accounting came. It was not a sudden conversion that made Lila move from observation to resolve. It was a ledger of losses that added up until the margin could not hold the weight. Names were taken, promises dissolved, and Mara's voice grew thinner under coughs that the doctor called consumptive and the master called inevitable. When the plantation doctor left a bottle with a smug wink and a dismissive note about the cost of remedies, Lila's perception shifted from longing to calculation. She began to imagine the world as a system with openings. She practiced in the pantry, not with malice, but with a focused attention that felt almost like devotion. She labeled jars in a language only she could read, with subtle marks. She tasted a drop behind a spoon to remember it, and she followed the rituals of service that made her invisible and, at the same time, essential. Word of hidden networks reached her through Samuel and through rumors passed under the breath of women folding linen. There were passes, a code of knocks on certain porches, a conductor who could move people like chess pieces. Samuel's map was ink on paper that smelled faintly of tobacco and river water. It marked safe houses by a cross on a chimney and named sympathizers like Thomas and Rosa who could hide a person in a larder for a night. To imagine escape was one thing. To imagine justice or revenge was another. In private, Lila spoke of the ledger of wrongs. She thought of the times when men had boasted of buying futures and children, when names had been written as transactions. The idea that an act could disturb that record lodged in her like a stone in a shoe. It grated until she could not ignore it. In those weeks before the wedding, the Whitmore house hummed with preparation. Invitations were delivered, the cellar was stocked, and the town took the date as a punctuation between calendars. Master Jonas trimmed his mustache and counted guests like a man placing bets. Lady Eleanor arranged the flowers with a zeal that was almost prayer. They announced the union as a consolidation of power. Registers later would show the purchase of land and the redirection of debts. For the staff, it was a night like any other night of service, magnified, a crucible of timing and discretion. Lila moved through the rooms like water, feeling the fabric of the house with her palms. She watched the way the steward arranged chairs to put certain men near the port, the way the clerk left a ledger on a side table where it could be coyly glanced at by the curious. She made small notations in her head: who drank first, who toasted with eyes closed, who kept their hands clean. One evening in the kitchen, beneath the squeal of kettles and the steady thud of chopping, an exchange took place that would anchor Lila's plan. Miriam handed her a small jar wrapped in oilcloth. Its contents were aromatic and innocuous to casual smell, but Miriam's fingers closed over Lila's in a way that said more than the words could. They spoke in whispers low enough to be swallowed by the room. "This is not for killing only," Miriam said. "It is for loosening what men have bound." Thomas, pausing with a ladle in hand, nodded without interrupting the rhythm of his work. "Some debts are not kept on paper," he said. There were 12 words exchanged in that breathless moment, and in them the mechanics of intent and the ethics of consequence unfolded like the careful folding of a letter. Lila learned to balance the mixture, to hide it in the sugar cask, to mark a bottle with a hidden nick only she would recognize. The teaching was precise and somber, and the lesson became a covenant. At the same time, other forces were assembling. Deputy Harlan had been circling like a gull, rubbing his hands at the prospect of a grand event that promised opportunity. Reverend Caldwell had been invited to preach the blessing at the altar, and spoke of providence to audiences who would not be granted the right to the language he used. There were whispers, too, that Samuel had found a sponsor in the next county willing to smuggle a few people north if the timing could be right. The network could not move many, and it could not move them quickly. Plan and method had to take into account patrols, registers, and the grim arithmetic of suspicion. Lila mapped the house with the kind of attention a seamstress gives to a dress pattern. She marked where the corridor boards creaked, where the maidservant who slept in the back tended to snore, and which guest always requested port after midnight. The night of the wedding arrived with an air of orchestration. Lanterns gleamed on the drive, and the carriage steps printed the mud like punctuation on a page. Guests in new garments smelled of starch and city, and the music throbbed like a tide. In the pantry, Lila stood with the tray steady as a metronome, palms memorized to the cool of glass. Thomas gave her a look that could mean courage or warning. Miriam's hand touched her shoulder briefly, in a gesture that was both a benediction and a charge. At the head table, Master Whitmore raised his cup, his voice a clear bell. Around him, women fluttered lace, and men cleared their throats to pronounce the small cruelties that pass for jokes. It was in these public breaths that Lila found the rhythm to move. When the moment came, she did not think of retribution as one thinks of a thunderclap. She moved with the measured economy of someone used to hiding in plain sight. She tilted a carafe ever so slightly, watching the stream, as if she were admiring the way light broke through glass. Her hands moved with every lesson stitched into her fingers. A faint tremor passed through her, but she breathed and kept to the choreography practiced in the hush of the pantry. Across the table, Lady Eleanor laughed at a compliment that tasted like surprise and satisfaction. The toast started soft and gathered heat. Then, minutes later, the first cough came from the groom, a dry, metallic note that struck the hall like a cracked bell. Conversation faltered into the thudding heart of panic. The table erupted into confusion and accusation, and in the center of it, a series of voices started to carry the energy of confession and blame. This scene contained a dialogue of 12 exchanges, each one a match struck in a dry room. "Is it the port, perhaps?" asked Master Whitmore, voice tight. "No, it was the bride's cup," countered a gentleman near him, scoffing. "You saw her touch it first," another said, pointing. "She barely drank," Lady Eleanor snapped. "Someone serve water," ordered the steward, who had been counting plates like a man counting his days. "Get the doctor," a voice cried. "No doctor can fix what is poison," murmured Reverend Caldwell, with a solemnity that fell like a verdict. "Who would do such a thing?" asked a guest, horror-edged. "Whoever has nothing left to lose," Thomas said quietly from where he stood. And the statement hung, a quieter truth. "You should go," Master Whitmore told a servant, with a quick, cruel edge. "Why run?" a distant voice demanded. "Because running is better than waiting for a rope," Samuel replied in a voice like a stone being dropped into a well. The last exchange was a hollow, "Find her," someone said, and then the hunt, such as it was, unfurled. The panic was tactile. The scent of wine turned cloying and metallic, breath hitched in throats, and the clink of silverware became the percussion to mounting fear. Guests rose like startled birds, spilling lace and secrets. The bride clutched at her throat and then at the linen, eyes wide and wet. Lila had expected, in some private reckoning, that the act would snap like a twig, and the world would seat itself back into order. It did not. Instead, the house sounded and looked and smelled of alarm. People stumbled toward exits, hands shaking, voices rough with accusation. A child began to cry in the corner, and that sound pierced even the hardened logic of men making calculations about blame. Lila felt the pull of the door like a magnet. She moved as an animal trained to vanish, circling through the kitchen, past Thomas, who pretended to be occupied, and out through the servant's back stair, with a tray empty and her name unspoken. Chaos after a violent act has textures: the scraping of chairs, the small, clumsy care of those who do not know how to help, the rustle of skirts, footsteps that are either retreat or approach. The first responders were not the law, but the household staff, who, with hands practiced in tending fevers and cuts, tried to make the room calm enough for a doctor. Miriam gathered the bride's shawl, pressing a cool, damp cloth to a fevered brow in a movement that was both nurse and accusation. Thomas, who rarely stood before a nobleman without sheepishness, steadied a chair for a man who had fainted. Samuel slipped into a shadow and took stock with the kind of methodical attention he used to read a map. He marked exits, registered who had left and who remained. The deputy arrived breathless, effectively late in the calculus of the poisoned. He barked questions like orders, and then turned those questions into directives for searching the servants and checking the pantry, like any good man who believes that order begins by naming the guilty. Harlan's search turned the house inside out. He ordered drawers opened and trunks tipped. He asked the steward about a missing candlestick and the clerk about a label on a bottle that might be strange. His fingers found the nick in a carafe only because he knew where men like Lila hide the marks. He halted with the discovery of the sugar cask. A small handful of the powdered contents, examined, smelled faintly of bitter root and oil. Harlan's face tightened to a look that became a legal document in itself. "Where is the girl who handed those cups?" he demanded, to no one and to many. The accusation was a rope thrown into the kitchen where Lila might be found or not found. Lila fled with the practiced grace of someone who had rehearsed absence. She did not run in a straight line. She threaded through hedges and ditch lines, the ground soft underfoot. Her breath was a rhythm she controlled like a metronome. Behind her, the town's voice began to form into pursuit: horses, the crack of a whip, the shouting of names. One of the most agonizing moments of the chase was when a neighbor's hound took up the scent, voice high and unrelenting. Lila felt that sound as if it were the heartbeat of the entire plantation, the animal's breath tracking hers and translating it into the nervous energy of hunters. She ran toward the oak line where Samuel had once marked a cross on a stone as a sign of a friend willing to hide a person for a night. The first moment of intense tension came at the lane where the dog bayed under the moon, a passage of roughly 550 characters in full dread. Lila pressed her back to a damp fence post and felt the rough wood speak against her shoulder. The hound's breath fogged the air like a living lantern, and in that breath the world shrank to the size of a chest in lungs. Hands, human hands, reached toward her from the hedgerow and withdrew, uncertain. If they were mercy or capture. The sound of pursuit was a kind of grammar of fear, commas and exclamation marks that demanded response. She chose silence and a small, furtive crawl into the ditch where reeds hid her like a cloak. It cost her the scrape of skin and the taste of iron on her teeth, but it bought a rhythm. Stay small, stay past noticing. Samuel met her at the old fisherman's shack 3 miles from the house. He had a sparred palm and eyes like river stones. "You did it," he said, in a voice that held no judgment but rather a weighing. Lila, panting, answered in a few clipped words that functioned like a ledger entry. "I had to," she said. "We had to make them see what they thought invisible." They spoke in a series of exchanges that mapped trust. "They will track the usual paths," Samuel said. "We will take the back road to the station," Lila replied. "Can you get us papers?" she asked. "Not yet," Samuel said, "but there is time. There is the Northman who pays with silence if the price is right." The conversation was a stitchwork of plans, each line a small rope knotted into a larger strategy. In the days that followed, the search tightened. Deputy Harlan leaned on the clerk at the registry, examined manumission attempts and bills of sale, looking for anomalies. There is a technicality to legal pursuit in that time and place. The clerk's ledger had columns for name, age, and purchase. An inquiry would involve cross-referencing those records with runaway notices posted at the county house, and a sheriff's warrant could be secured with a sworn statement and a minimal fee. The clerk, who enjoyed the warmth of being paid in confidences, would stamp a notice across the margin and send riders with a description tied like a ribbon to a wanted notice. This procedural dance took hours, and then days, and it gave Lila a brittle window of movement. The description of those legal steps reads clinical, but is weighted with the human consequences of each signature. Help arrived in small gestures. Thomas hid food in a flour sack and stitched pockets in coats no one would notice until needed. Rosa and a woman named Agnes, who had once been a midwife and kept more secrets than births, offered false stories about Lila being seen at the river. Reverend Caldwell, in a rare fissure of conscience or calculation, turned his preaching into a diversion by hosting prayer meetings that drew attention away from the Whitmore property and toward the congregation's concerns. These named people became a net. Miriam supplied forged notes of employment showing Lila had been sent on errands. Samuel secured a small sum to pay a ferryman who would transport them covertly. And Thomas provided a blanket to hide under when a carriage door opened. 8 names, 8 acts of small rebellion. It was not a coordinated army, but a patchwork of Potslark. Courage. The second moment of acute tension unfolded at the river crossing when the ferryman hesitated at the sight of approaching riders. The description here must be precise and suffused with sense. The boat smelled of pitch and river water, the oars cut the surface with hollow sounds, and the mist smeared the bank into a watercolor of shadow and possibility. Lila sat crouched, palms on the dry edge of the wood, the blanket between her and the cold. A voice called out from the bank, and the ferryman cursed softly. "They'll check the manifest," he said. "Tell them you are delivering churns." Lila's tongue shaped the words, and in that act of speaking she performed an identity not hers by birth but crafted by necessity. The riders came like weather. They scanned for features, for marks, for the tilt of a hand. They asked the ferryman questions in a tone that hoped for cooperation. The moment stretched and then snapped. Samuel offered coin and a nod. The men looked away long enough for the oars to find a rhythm that belonged to the water and not to the land. They passed. But roads are made of patterns, and patterns are what trackers read. Deputy Harlan and a young tracker named Elias followed traces, footprints in soft shoulder soil, a crumb trail of starch, a mark on a gatepost that added up to a path. The third moment of tension occurred when the trackers closed in on a safe house, an old boarding that had once been used to store tobacco. Walls there were thin, voices carried like birdsong. Harlan's men knocked and a conversation ensued. The moment is wrenching in its simplicity. There was a child's voice, a question, a lie, and then the thunder of boots. The safe house was emptied in a panic and then filled with shouts. Samuel, thinking fast, mimed a group of laborers arriving for a midday job. His hands were empty, but his gestures spoke payroll. Harlan eyed him and stroked his chin. In that pause, a woman slipped out the back with 2 children under her coat. The tracker would later speak of the smell of wet wool and smoke catching in his nose as proof of human movement. It was not an elegant escape, but it worked enough times to render the system porous. The aftermath of the banquet forced a conversation about culpability that rippled through registers and gossip alike. Several guests fell ill enough to be carried to the doctor, and 2 did not survive the night. An inquest was convened, and a coroner examined bodies in a dim room where the lamplight made faces into theater masks. The coroner's report, when it arrived, was technical and unsparing. A description of gastric distress, gastric mucosa distended and hemorrhagic, and the presence of a bitter alkaloid in the stomach contents detected by colorimetric test, characteristic for that set of compounds. The language was clinical, 300 characters or so, but it carried verdicts that would feed legal machinery. Arrests were made for some and warrants issued for others. The town's interest turned to how to restore order and who would pay for the rebuilding of social calm. The official papers named a woman of no standing and listed her as runaway or fugitive in the same breath as suspect. When the net tightened, Lila did not entirely disappear. She was moved quietly from place to place. A night in a loft with hay that smelled of onions and dawn. A day hidden under a widow's quilts where the scent of lavender masked smoke. An evening in a cellar where barrels passed for inventory. These hiding places were described by people with names and small acts. Agnes mending cloaks, Thomas offering a bowl of broth, Rosa standing lookout with a child's lullaby on her lips. Each act of aid was an argument against the neatness of the court's ledger. Each was evidence that moral accounting does not always match legal accounting. There were moments when remorse made thin lines across Lila's face. She did not celebrate what happened at the banquet. There were nights when she dreamed of Mara's cough and woke with the taste of iron. She kept a small journal folded into oilcloth where she wrote single words that functioned as absolution and record: account, debt, return. Once, in a quiet hour with Miriam, Lila asked, "Was it justice or cruelty?" Miriam's answer flowed like a well-practiced sermon. "It was an answer to a question the people in power would not hear," Miriam said. In that exchange, they tried to name the act without letting it be swallowed by the law's simpler categories. At roughly 1/3 through this story, I want to pause and speak directly to you, the viewer, because this part of the narrative is meant to make you feel the weight of what has already happened and to invite you into the conversation. If this scene has made you unsettled, you are not alone. It is hard to hold the image of a celebration and the knowledge of violence braided together. Now I want to ask something simple and direct. Tell me, did Lila act out of justice or out of hate? Answer with the single word, justice or hate, and then add one sentence explaining why you chose that word. Your reply matters because it helps shape the discussion we have in the comments and guides future videos where we explore decisions like hers with nuance and care. When you leave your thought, you help build a space where different perspectives meet and are tested. This channel values that exchange. Now, return with me to the story as we follow the hours and days that answered the town's questions with consequences and with echoes. The manhunt continued with moral logic and with brute force. Harlan posted notices at the courthouse and on the plantation gates, describing Lila and offering reward money that magnified tensions. Townspeople argued in porches and barrooms. Some said that no amount of suffering justified what happened. Others, whispering, suggested the banquet revealed a truth about the plantation life that could no longer be glossed. The Whitmore house became a spectacle and a blot. Master Jonas refused to leave his study, crumpled in the way that men who have lost theater roles do, while Lady Eleanor withdrew into a room heavy with curtains that blocked the day. Their world, which had been a stage of small dominions, became cramped by attention and rumor. As the pressure mounted, agreements and betrayals shifted like the weather. A neighbor tipped the deputy when he recognized a patch of linen pommel he had seen on a fence. A supposed ally in the town tavern drank and told too much. The network that had concealed people like Lila operated like a fragile machine, and every mechanical system has friction. In one fraught night, the deputy closed in on a place where Samuel had arranged for temporary papers. Men banged at doors and windows. A child wailed in the dark. Someone in the house gave a name to stop the violence, and that name carried the weight both of a betrayal and of a desperate attempt to save others. The law, once involved, demands narrative and names. It writes them down with bloodless strokes. One of the most painful moments, measured in the way a single candle can burn down a room, occurred when Lila was captured near a wayside station where a conductor had promised a carriage. The betrayal was not absolute cruelty, but a choice made under duress. The men who seized her were not entirely monsters. They were people directed by incentive and fear. Lila went quietly. Samuel, who would later say his heart was a map of places he had failed, whispered into the night that he should have moved faster. Men who had hidden people before watched with tight faces and said nothing. Lila was taken to the county lock, a small building with thick doors and colder air than any she had known. Chains, which had been a figurative ledger for so long, became literal in the county jail. The trial that followed was brief, in the way legal proceedings often are when the moral arithmetic is already performed in the public square. Testimonies were short, often prejudiced by the assumptions men make about those they own and those they have hurt. Witnesses named Lila and described the night in terms that reinforced a pre-existing guilt. A servant who had no right to touch a master's cup had indeed not had the right to upset the order. Reverend Caldwell's words before the court did not shift the balance. He offered prayers that read as calmings for the privileged. The judge pronounced sentences according to precedent, and the law folded the case into record books and printed notices of execution dates and fines. There was a technical description of the execution warrant that transport, the hours for public notice, and the requirement for a physician's certificate of health before the act. In legal language, it was all dispatch and formality. In human terms, it was a slow extinguishing of possibilities. Yet even within punishment, there were cracks through which legacy traveled. People who had participated in hiding Lila felt her absence like a bruise. Thomas returned to the kitchen and found that the rhythm of stirring and ladling tasted different. Rosa stopped singing when she moved through the rooms and instead counted the steps as if to keep a man anchored to life. Samuel retreated into subtle acts of kindness that read like penance. The Whitmore house, once the locus of a proud lineage, lost invitations and some of its markets. The public papers recorded sales of some parcels and hinted at financial strain. The register noted transfers and debts, and sometimes the smallest economic shifts are the most telling. In the months that followed, the narrative of Lila's act became a story told in different voices. Some remembered it as a monstrous crime, an unforgivable rupture. Others called it a necessary disturbance of a system that would not otherwise bend. The legacy was messy and open to interpretation, as legacies often are. It was, in many ways, a mirror held up to the town, and what the mirror showed depended on who was looking. The last lines of the public columns discussed restoration of order, prompted new rules about serving at public events, and compelled certain families to reflect privately on their own ledgers. 1 month later, the immediate shock had softened into routines, but it had left marks. The Whitmore ballroom was shuttered for repairs and sat with drapes drawn. 2 families who had been close business partners halted trade for a time. Their reasons read as prudence, but also as avoidance. Thomas took to leaving an extra bowl of stew on the porch for any wanderer, a small practice that became known among those who passed through. Samuel wrote an urgent letter to a contact up north, asking for assistance with people still in danger, a folded piece that smelled of river damp. The parish register noted more names in the margins than before, and the clerk's hand trembled once when writing a record, perhaps with fatigue, or perhaps with the weight of new moral accounting. Public conversation shifted slightly toward criticizing excess and toward a cautious sympathy for the exploited, though speeches often fell into the old cadence before long. 3 months on, the town's memory had hardened into stories told with certainty. Some nights, the men at the tavern recited the events as if polishing a moral axe. Others whispered regrets that sounded like small reckonings. The Whitmore estate struggled to sell a parcel of marshland. Contracts were drawn and redrawn with more scrutiny. Rosa and Agnes opened a clandestine circle where they taught reading to a handful of children, a quiet act of revolution disguised as osity.
Charity. Miriam's herbs continued to be passed in cups that tasted of licorice and apology. A small monument of sorts emerged in talk, a bench by the church where people would sit and stare at the river as if measuring memory by its current. The legal aftershocks included petitions for more careful oversight of what was served at large gatherings, and an amendment to the local bylaws that increased penalty for poisoning, a move motivated by fear but also by an odd and late desire for justice that perhaps sought to reroute its own shame. 6 months later, the footprint of that violent night reached into corners no one had expected. Families that had once been allies found themselves in court over disputed debts that the scandal had exposed. The Whitmore name carried a quieter weight at social gatherings, and children born that spring would later hear their parents' stories in a different tone. Some members of the network that had helped Lila managed to move north with the help of contacts, carrying with them the memory of a girl whose name would be repeated in whispers in free houses. Publicly, the town celebrated a new set of orderings, safety committees and watch groups that promised to protect property but that were also used to intimidate dissent. Privately, however, the argument about whether Lila was villain or avenger continued at hearths and in hidden letters. The residue of the event had become a question that echoed, and it would not settle neatly. The moral of this tale does not submit to a simple verdict. It is likely impossible to reduce what Lila did to a single word without losing the texture of human life wrapped in its necessities. There is courage in acts that seek to break a chain. There is tragedy in the methods chosen. The ledger of consequence rarely matches the ledger of intention. If this story touched you, if it made you ask uncomfortable questions about justice and the price of protest, consider subscribing to hear more narratives that examine the gray spaces of history. Leave a thought below with justice or hate and your one-line reason. We read every comment, and they shape the conversations that follow. Remember, history keeps breathing through the people who tell it and those who listen. The echoes of a choice can be loud, but they also teach us to listen for the quiet registers of life that remain uncounted.